In the past week, we discussed the whole process of how to slaughter an animal, how to make food kasher. The various animals that are kosher, that can be eaten, and those that cannot be eaten. Now we're entering a second stage in how to maintain a kosher home, a very important area, the area of basar v'halav. This we encounter much more often at home than the stage that I spoke about last week. Because last week we spoke about something which we don't really have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. The meat is already salted, as I explained. We don't have to slaughter the meat. We have to know to identify which fish are kosher. Perhaps that one area is important. But otherwise, we don't deal with it as much as this area. And this area is so involved and there's so many details that we will not be able to cover it all in one session. We're going to need maybe 2 or 3 sessions to cover all the details. And we will not be able to cover all the details. That is why there will be situations where I urge you that if it ever comes up, if you're in doubt about something, that you consult with a rabbi who's familiar with the halachot of basar v'halav, because there are quite a few details. It's not possible for us to cover all of this. Those who are learning to become rabbis spend 2 years learning hilchot basar v'halav and taruvot and shchita and trefot if you want to know that too. It takes time to become proficient. So what I'm going to be doing is giving you not a summary but an overview of the issues to be concerned about, to be familiar with, and a little bit the halachot as well. Those are halachot that we need to be familiar with because we do come across them in the kitchen all the time. So we need to be aware, we need to be familiar with them. Basar v'halav, the mixture of milk and meat, is a very important area because this is one of the only isurim. There are very few isurim in the Torah which the mixture of them, in this case the mixture of basar v'halav, is asur be'achila, be'bishul u'behana'ah. It says, lo tevashel gdil b'halev imo 3 times in the Torah, that you should not cook the meat of a calf with the mother's milk. And it says it 3 times, so the rabbis tell us that the reason the Torah mentioned it 3 times is because this is one of the isurim that is prohibited be'achila, be'bishul u'behana'ah. All 3. It cannot be cooked, it cannot be eaten, and one cannot benefit from the mixtures of all 3. And this is very important because these things may happen occasionally, that the two may get mixed unintentionally, of course. And we won't get to that today, but I'll give you an example of how the two can get mixed. A little bit of milk poured onto the meat, very simply. You didn't intend it to, but it happened. So we have to know what the halachot is of that food, and what the halachot are concerning the kdera, the sir, the pot in which this mixture has been made. So first let's talk about bishul, cooking. When we say cooking, we also mean tigun and we also mean sli. Any other method of cooking, it could be frying or it could be roasting, right? It's still called cooking. The only types of cooking, or the only kind of mixture which would not be prohibited by the Torah, but it's prohibited by rabbinic decree, is something which is called maluach or kavush. Kavush means preserved or pickled together. If 2 items, milk and meat for example, were together in the same jar for more than 24 hours, it's called kavush. It is the immersion of the two is so strong after 24 hours that it is as though they were cooked together. The same thing if it was salted, a very, very heavy salting process can also accomplish almost what cooking can do, if the 2 of them are together. But the only one that is asur be'achila, to eat, the combination of the 2 would be if it was cooked together. Midoraita, one cannot eat something that was cooked together. But the rest would be by rabbinic decree. Now, how could this happen today other than drops of milk falling on meat? It could also happen in a very unusual way that people are unaware of. Let's say all you have is one sink, and we will be talking about that a little bit later on, how to deal with having only one sink, where ideally a kosher kitchen should have 2 separate sinks. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. But as far as the problem of bishul, the immediate problem is if there are shirayim. Shirayim in a sink, meaning remnants or leftovers of meat. You threw the bones and you threw the meat, leftovers from a plate, and you have some leftover pizza or cheese, blintzes or whatever, you threw into the sink. I know some people don't like having any food in the sink, even if they have a garbage disposal. It's just not good habits. It's just, throw it into the garbage can and leave your dishes as clean as possible, because the sink is not a garbage can. Nevertheless, some people just throw everything there and then they somehow remove it. The problem is, if you are only having one sink and you have leftovers of the meat and the dairy in the same sink, and you pour boiling hot water on the mixture, that's called bishul. Even though the bishul is only kedei klipa, anytime the hot water is coming running down, it's not being cooked, but it's coming, the irui as it's called in Hebrew, coming down as a stream. That irui, or that stream, can cook kedei klipa. The amount that it is able to penetrate in the meat is a small, thin layer. But nevertheless, that's called bishul, and that would be asur. So one would be over halila, on the transgression of cooking the mixture just by pouring hot, boiling water on the two, sitting in the sink. That is one of the disadvantages of having leftovers at the same time in one sink. You can still have one sink, but just make sure that you don't have the two dishes, the two sets of dishes, or the two foods of milk and meat at the same time in the sink. Or you can run into that problem of bishul. Now, how could we run into the problem of eating? Most people don't eat. I mean, Jews that know the prohibition of eating milk and meat are not going to have a glass of milk with a piece of steak. We know that it's asur, even though I've seen that goyim don't care. They actually like it. They have cheeseburgers. They have no problem with eating meat and having a glass of milk. As far as they're concerned, the two are compatible. They see nothing wrong with it. Where can we run, therefore, into the problem, not knowingly? With trufot, with medicine. Medicine, the two ingredients might be ground, they might be mixed in a way that we do not see them anymore, and we're eating them. So somebody who's sick and needs to take medicine, he has to make sure that the medicine that he's taking is kosher. Now, when we say kosher medicine, we're implying several things. There could be a lot of problems with medicine. We haven't gotten to that yet. Eventually we'll cover the problems with medicine. But one of the problems could be simply nevelotu trefot, gelatin that is made from animals, from animal bone. But there's an exemption for that. And we'll talk about that later. But even if there are exemptions, if the same medicine exists in a kosher version, you obviously are better off getting a medicine that's kosher. We're not talking about somebody who's very, very sick, and that's the only medicine in the market. Obviously, he can take anything that he needs to cure himself. But we're talking about a regular sick person that needs something, he has a flu. You want to make sure that there's no basar v'halav mixed in that medicine. Otherwise, you are eating basar v'halav, not knowing about it. But there are other issues in medicine, and we'll get to that at a later date. Now, we have the third isur, the isur of hana'ah, benefiting. Usually, if you have something which is tarif, which is not kosher, you can benefit from it. Eventually, we'll talk about the prohibition against doing business on a steady basis, minevelotu trefot. You cannot have a business with non-kosher food if you're doing it at all times. That's one of the businesses that you cannot get into as a Jew. To benefit, or I shouldn't say the word benefit, but to do business with nevelot and trefot. And I'll tell you why when we get to that point. But in the meantime, what we're concerned with here is not doing business, but having benefit, direct benefit, deriving benefit from something which is asur behana'ah, and that is basar behalab. So therefore, if something became prohibited because it has a mixture of basar behalab, you cannot have any benefit. How would you have benefit? Feeding it to your dog. That's having benefit. So you would not be able to feed it to your dog. You cannot give it as a gift to a goy, to your neighbor. Want to have some good steak today? Here, I can't have it. It has a little bit of milk in it. You can't give it. You can't have any benefit from it. It has to be destroyed. Or you can't sell it, of course. So there are people who are in the business of experimenting, chemists, and they're benefiting from, trying to discover things. They cannot mix chemicals or whatever they're trying to do in creating medicine if that mixture would involve basar v'halav, the same reasons I mentioned before. Either it's bishul, a form of bishul, or it's hana'ah. You cannot derive any benefit from the mixture of these two items. No, you cannot. Right. That's a form of benefit because you're doing him a favor. He owes you a favor now. So you cannot have any benefit from the mixture of the two. You have to destroy it. It's one of those items. There are few items in the Torah that are asur b'hana'ah, complete isur, no benefit whatsoever. Okay.
Only if it's cooked.
Only if it's been cooked together. Each item by itself is mutar. The basar, the meat by itself is okay. The milk by itself is okay. But once the two come together, that's a very unusual prohibition in the Torah. You don't see that anywhere in the Torah where the two of them are mutarim, and only combining them it becomes asur. Actually, there's something else called kil'ayim, which we'll talk about also later. Yes?
If they're both cold, and they touch each other.
I'm going to get to that. That's for sure. We're going to cover all of that. So here you have just a few examples of bishul, achila, and hana'ah, of where each one would be prohibited, whether it's cooking, the mixture of them, or eating them, or benefiting from them. Now all of this is only applicable in reality to basar kasher, basar tahor, with halaf tahor. You have milk of a cow and you have meat of a cow or of deer, any animal that's kosher with milk that's kosher. Let's say you have a mixture of milk that's non-kosher, camel's milk, and cow's meat. There's no isur basar behalav in it. You can't eat it, obviously, because it's camel's milk, but you're not transgressing the prohibition. The prohibition only applies kosher with kosher. Let's say the meat is not kosher and the milk is kosher, also not. They both have to be kosher for one to be transgressing. You can't eat it anyway, but we're concerned about this transgression. Why would I want to know what the halakha is? Anybody know here? Why would I want to know if I'm allowed to cook camel's milk with meat? If I don't intend to eat it anyway. Anybody know? No, why would I ever want to do that? How would somebody ever come to a situation where he's cooking non-kosher meat? See, I just gave you a clue here. Non-kosher meat with kosher milk. Let's say he works in a restaurant. He works for McDonald's. It's not the best job, by the way, for a Jew, to smell all that food that's non-kosher, to be around that food. I think you should find yourself another job if that's the only job you have. Unless you're in Buenos Aires where there's a glass kosher McDonald's. Yeah, that's what I'm told. And in Israel too lately. But otherwise, if you happen to be working in a non-kosher restaurant or in a situation where you're preparing food for a goy who's allowed to eat that combination, you want to know if you're allowed to cook the combination of the two. There's no isur. So if it's regular milk and regular meat, then of course you cannot make the cheeseburger. Even if you do not plan to eat it, you cannot fry or roast or cook the cheese with the milk. But if it happens to be that one of the meats is from a non-clean animal, like, let's take an example, non-clean animal, what would they eat as non-clean animal? Pig meat, ham, right? With milk, there would be no transgression. I don't know who would want to do something like that, but in case somebody has to do that, he needs to know the halakha. There's no transgression. Same applies to the hana'ah. You would be able to have benefit from that by selling it, but of course one cannot eat it regardless, because one of them is tameh, is unclean. That's a nevela. So it's still asur basar v'chalav because it's a behema tehora. It's a clean animal, unless it's an unclean animal. It would have to be unclean animal for one not to be transgressing the prohibition. All right. How about chicken? Chicken, there's no isur according to the Torah. According to the Torah, there's no problem with having a glass of milk at the same time eating a piece of chicken. There's no such prohibition of even mixing or cooking the two. You can even do that today. For some reason, you have to do it for a goy. No prohibition. There is a prohibition, nevertheless, by rabbinic decree. The rabbis tell us you cannot eat the two together. Why? Because chicken resembles meat, and people will tend to confuse the two. And a lot of what the rabbis did was to distance one from the actual real sin. The sin is such and such, the transgression is such and such, but because people may come easily to do it, we're going to maintain further distance. We're going to tell you don't eat chicken with milk, so you should not come by mistake to eat meat with milk. People might make a mistake. Oh, this looks the same. Therefore, chicken is not allowed to be eaten with milk. Now, there is something called, in Arabic, sharab loz. Anybody who is familiar with that drink, it's a drink made from almonds. It looks exactly like milk. It's the drink made from almonds. And it's served in the Syrian community very much. It's served in all sorts of happy occasions. It's a very tasty drink. And it looks just like milk. And the rabbis tell us, if you serve that with meat, make sure you put some almonds around. So people should know that this is almond milk and not true milk. Otherwise people will think, oh, it's okay. Maybe one rabbi said it was okay now for me to have a glass of milk. After all, he sees milk. He's not going to look at it, smell it, and taste it perhaps, and he's going to assume it's permissible. So there is something called marit ayn, and we will come across it many times in halakha. Marit ayn means because of the observation of the eye, certain things are prohibited. People might assume it's okay just because they see. And not everybody asks when they see something. If people would ask, it's one thing. But a lot of people just see, they assume, and they reach their own conclusions. Whenever you're in doubt, ask. A lot of people get insulted, offended by somebody because that person said something or did something. And if they would ask, they would find out that they never really meant anything like that. That person had this impression.
It happens between husbands and wife who don't communicate well. One has this impression that, oh, she must be doing it because of this, or she did that because of this. Ask. You'll avoid a lot of problems if you ask, if you speak up and investigate. But rabbis were very practical and very realistic. They knew that people do not ask. They assume. And if they observe something, and they won't ask, they might reach an erroneous conclusion. That's called marit ayin. So the rabbis therefore prohibited many things because of marit ayin. And they tell us, therefore, if you're going to serve this drink, put almonds. Unless it's chicken, because if it's chicken, it's midrabanan anyway, so we're not concerned. But with meat, because the combination with real milk is asur, people might have the wrong ideas. Put almonds around it. All right, what do we do with fish and milk? How about fish and milk? Lox and cream cheese. That's a typical combination. What do you say? There are various opinions. Ashkenazim for sure don't have a problem with this. They have it all the time. There's one exception, and that is no one cooks the two together. Cooking together milk and fish is not advisable. And it could be that is the source of the prohibition of the Sfaradim. When the Sfaradim prohibited milk and fish, it's not necessarily because the combination of the two, eating them together, is unhealthy. It could be what they meant was, what that opinion meant was cooking the two together. And from the prohibition or from the advice of not cooking, that advice was extended to not eating together. But many opinions would hold that for everybody it's perfectly okay to eat the two together. So you follow whatever your tradition is. There are some, by the way, who don't eat the two together, but they will eat fish with butter. Butter, they said, is okay. So follow whatever your tradition is. But I can assure you that from what we know, the biggest problem is cooking them together, not eating them together. The only concern was health. And the rabbis did tell us when it comes to health, hamira sakanta mi'isura. Health matters, health issues are stricter than simply prohibited. If something is prohibited because the Torah prohibited, there's a reason for it. But if something is prohibited, mi'isura and misakanta, because it's dangerous, we don't take any chances. In other words, it's stricter. If you have any doubts about it, would you eat it anyway? No, because this might be dangerous. So sakanta, hamira sakanta mi'isura. But that really is much more the case with the following item. Dagim in basar. That everybody agrees is dangerous. Don't eat meat with chicken together at the same time. Not only that, many people I'm sorry. What did I say? No, I'm sorry. Fish and meat together. Do not eat fish and meat together. What do people do on Shabbat when one of the dishes is fish? Do they eat the meat right away? No, they have soup in between. And if they don't have soup in between, they eat a piece of challah right after they finished eating the gefilte fish or whatever. Or they have a glass of schnapps, whatever you prefer. Arak, cognac, whiskey. It's all the same. It washes the mouth. It rinses the mouth. So you don't have immediately the meat after the fish. And a lot of people are even more mahmir, are even more stricter. They even wash their hands, especially if they were eating with their hands. So they have a little bit of the fish on their hands. What is that?
Wash your hands or wash your mouth. It's not food together.
We're not talking about the problem of eating one right after the other. We're talking about the problem of eating them at the same time. So if there's a little bit of time in between them, it's not a problem.
Change the bones, right?
Well, the bones is a separate issue.
Why
The combination of the two somehow is a problem. And this arises also in a different area of kashrut, in baking the two together in the same oven. That is a whole area in itself that B'ezrat Hashem will be covering next week. How to bake at the same time using the same oven, if at all possible, dairy and meat. We will see. There are many details. It's not so easily done. It can be done, but it's we'll talk. I'll leave it for next week. Yes, fish and milk. Yes. Tuna melt? I don't know what that is. You can convert to an Ashkenaz, and then you won't have a problem.
Cheese is melted on top.
Yeah.
It's a very common food.
Yeah? Yeah, I can just assure you that there is no problems from what we know with fish and milk. But some, of course, are of the opinion that the whole prohibition was enacted because of concerns, at least in the past, that there may be a problem with combining the two, mitame briut, in other words, for health reasons. But some say no, there's never been a problem. So it's really this is more of a question of facts. Is it or is it not? And if you can determine that it's not, then it shouldn't be prohibited. So you see, so this is a much more lenient problem, if at all. It's not really a problem, but some have accepted it as a problem, and they stick with that. But in reality, it's not. But cooking is a whole different issue. Cooking the two together, just like it is with fish and meat. According to what we know today, there is no health issue. All right, let's go to the next item. Achilat basar v'chalav al oto shulchan. Let's say you're in the mood of eating steak and your wife wants to eat pizza. Can you both eat at the same table? That's the question over here. What? Well, I would suggest that you both come to an agreement to eat the same thing, so you can enjoy it a little bit better. But let's say it's two brothers, which is much more common, where each one is in the mood of eating something else. One says, I don't want leftovers, and one says, I'm tired of this, and whatever. They both want to have two different types of dishes. And one is dairy, and one is meat. The two can eat at the same table on condition that there is a distance between them, the two opposite sides of the table. So why? So they don't come to share each other's food. That's all. It's very simple. You could, two brothers. Let me taste a little bit of that. What do you have there? It looks good. So if there's a distance between them at the opposite ends of the table, they will realize that, we can't just grab each other's food. Or what you could also do is put something neutral, like a flower pot, in the middle. That's usually not there. They will realize, oh, okay, we better be careful. This one is eating meat and I'm eating dairy. We better be careful. Or each one has a separate placemat. Something to distinguish between the two of them, so they can remember. It's just a reminder, so they don't come to mixing the foods. Yes. No. The problem is only with meat and milk right now. Only basar v'chalav. Now let's say the two don't know each other. Two people at work. They don't know each other. One sits at this table, the other one brings his food. No problem. Not only is it okay to have basar v'chalav if the two don't know each other, because we don't suspect they'll come to share, even if the other individual is a goy and he brings his ham and bacon and eggs. He's allowed to sit at the same picnic table as you, because we don't suspect and we're not worried that you're going to share his food, right? You don't know him. Or you know him, but he's a goy and you know what he has is tarif. So we don't suspect and we're not concerned that you may come to share his food. But if he's a family member at your home, and this happens sometimes, not even at my home, it happens, I want to eat something and the kids are eating something else, then we have to have separate placemats or eat at opposite ends of the table. And by the way, when you do eat together, and one is eating basar and the other one is eating halal, make sure that you don't share the same cup. No drinking from the same cup, no use of the same knife. The knife is a separate problem. Eventually we'll talk about it. What happens if you did use the knife, to cut meat or to cut bread? How could, if, for example, if you use a knife that is used for meat to cut a piece of bread, and that bread that you just cut has to be eaten with meat, not with dairy. How could you use that knife to cut bread to eat with dairy? You would have to stick it in the ground 10 times in different spots. That sticking the knife in the ground is a form of cleansing that is sufficient to allow you to slice the bread now and eat that bread with dairy, even though it was always used for meat. So there are ways to accomplish an immediate form of cleansing for knives in the ground, in the earth, in a plant that has dirt, but the dirt has to be pretty hard, not soft. But otherwise, you have to be careful with using knives that are ordinarily used for something else, to use it, even though all you're doing is cutting bread, because a knife is sharp, and a little bit is transferred from the knife and the flavor, from the ta'am of the basar into the bread. Now we come to a very popular question area. How many hours do I have to wait after I've eaten meat to have my favorite cheesecake? Or somebody wants to have his ice cream bar, you just remember, but I just had meat. How long do you have to wait? So first of all, we need to know what the problem is. Why do we need to wait after we eat meat to eat milk, to drink milk or to eat milk? So there are two reasons. There are two explanations that are brought down. One is because of the shuman of the basar, that when one eats meat, it lets out a certain amount of grease. And that grease, or the flavor of it, stays behind a long time. Because it stays behind a long time, you have to wait until it dissipates. And it takes 6 hours or so to dissipate until you can have the milk. So they should not combine. Even though you're not eating them at the same time, nevertheless, this is not, by the way, according to the Torah. This is by rabbinic decree. It is a form of combination, and you have to give it time. According to the Rambam, the real reason is because of basar ben hashinaim. When you eat meat, there's always a little bit left over of the meat in between the teeth, unless you floss, maybe. But otherwise, there's a little bit left over, and it takes us 6 hours for the leftovers to fall apart, to be, not completely to disappear, but it falls apart completely, or to digest. And after that, you can eat. What difference does it make what the reason is? It makes a difference. If, let's say you want to give your child, your toddler, a piece of meat, and you want to chew it for him, so it becomes soft. But you're not going to eat it. You're not going to swallow it. Because you chewed the meat, even though you didn't swallow it and eat it, you had it in your mouth. According to the second reason, you would also have to wait 6 hours, even though you haven't eaten the meat. That's the difference between the two experiences. But otherwise, the custom is, most communities in the world, most Jewish communities, wait after meat 6 hours. There are various customs, but that is the basic standard, 6 hours. Except, there are two exceptions. I wrote here, I divided it into three groups. Adults, and those who are ill, and children. Those, of course, pregnant women or those who recently gave birth would fall into the same category. It would be permissible for them to wait, if necessary, only 1 hour. 1 hour would be therefore the bare minimum for those who are sick and need to eat or to drink something that is of the other class. In other words, in this case, milk, after they ate meat. What about children? What do we do with children? With children, I left it in parentheses. I didn't put any amount of time because it all depends. If they're already 12 years old, then they're almost like adults. They should definitely wait the 6 hours. But if you're dealing with a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old child, that he needs to have his glass of milk before he goes to bed and things like that, you don't have to be mahmir. You don't have to be strict and wait. No, you got to wait 6 hours. So with children, you basically evaluate the situation, and you don't have to be as strict as with adults. That's why I left it in parentheses. You evaluate the situation according to the circumstances, but the minimum should be 1 hour. There should be at least 1 hour between the two, until 12. Once they get to 12, you don't play around. They're almost like adults. No, but there's obviously a difference, and we'll talk about that, between something that is a tafshil or something which is actual meat or milk. And I think let me see if that was next. Yeah, I was going to speak about that next, so it's good you mentioned it. There's something called tafshil besari. Let's say you do not have meat or a meat dish, but you had soup that had pieces of meat in it. In other words, tafshil besari. You're not eating the actual meat, but you're having something that was cooked with meat. So it's besari. You still have to wait 6 hours, even though you're not eating the meat itself. But perhaps with kids, if you have what's called a dairy candy or so that has perhaps an ingredient that may be made of milk, you don't have to be as mahmir. But we are mahmir for adults, whether it's milk or derivative of milk, whether it's meat or whether it's a tafshil basari, to wait the full 6 hours. But for kids, you can be a little bit more lenient in that respect. All right, what about the other way around? You're going to have meat after milk. Is that a problem? No. You can have a glass of milk, you can have your cereal, and then you want to eat something with meat. It's perfectly fine, unless it's hard cheese. Some opinions hold that if it's Swiss hard, the Swiss cheese, the very hard cheese, you need to wait 6 hours as well. Not everybody follows this opinion, but everybody does at least the minimum. If you've eaten cheese, especially the hard cheese, then definitely one should rinse his mouth, wash his hands, and eat something which is not sticky, like bread, in between the two, so that there should be nothing in the mouth, at least, of the leftovers of the hard cheese, right before you're about to eat it. So this is the bare minimum one needs to do after eating cheese, if he immediately wants to have meat. And that is at least to rinse his mouth, to wash his hands, especially if it came in contact with it. If there was no contact, let's say you just drank something, then obviously you don't have to wash your hands. But if your hands came in contact with the cheese, then they should be washed as well. And something should be eaten that's lo davik. For example, dates are sticky, they stick to the teeth, to the gums, and that may not remove any leftovers well. So it's best to eat something like bread that will absorb or take away whatever leftovers in the mouth, so there should be no combining of the cheese and the meat at the same time in the mouth. Rinsing, washing the hands, and eating something between will be the bare minimum. But others do wait the 6 hours, especially if it's a very, very hard cheese. Ashkenazim are stricter in this than the Sephardim. All right, let's go on to the next area, tafshil parve. In basar v'halav, you will come across a term called ben yomo, a pot that was used on that day, or sir she'eno ben yomo, a pot that was not used that day. It makes a big difference in this area of halachot or kashrut. And I think perhaps we'll get to it maybe next week. But a pot that was used that day, let's say for meat, you cooked goulash in the morning. You prepared goulash. You know what goulash is? Pieces of meat with potatoes, a real dish stew. And now, so the pot for sure is a pot of meat. Sir Besari, not only is it a meat pot, it was used that day, so the flavor is still in there. Now you want to make palau. Anybody know what that is? Any Persians or Bukharim here? You want to make a good rice. No meat inside. Rice, maybe a little bit of raisins, right? That's all you're doing, but you're using that pot, that meat pot. But all there is in there is rice. But you want to have this rice with some cheese. Can you have that rice with cheese? There's no meat in the rice. What do you say? No meat in the rice whatsoever. You made rice. This happens all the time, by the way. My wife always asks me, she forgets what the halakha is. You made rice. Rice is part of it, right? It's not meat, it's not dairy, it's called part of it. But you made it in a pot which belongs to meat. If you ordinarily, regularly cook meat in it. After you've made this rice which has not one bit of meat, can you eat this rice with milk, with cheese? Depends if you're a Sephardi or Ashkenazi. This area is called nat barnat. See it right down here? Maybe you can't understand what it is, but it means noten tam bar noten tam, which I'll explain some other time. Right now, all you need to know is that if you're a Sephardi, there's no problem. No problem. If you're an Ashkenaz, you can't have it with milk. If that pot was used on that day. Now, obviously, if you forgot and you ate it, it's not a problem. This is an extra humrah, where it's a certain strict observance here. If you have it, you mix the two, you can have it, no problem. Somebody by mistake put cheese and put milk, it's okay. But lechat chilaf for the Ashkenaz, you don't have that with milk. If it was used on that day. If it was not used on that day, then it's not as much of a problem. Because any flavor that's left in the pot is called tam pagum. It's defective. In other words, the flavor is gone almost. So this would make a big difference whether that pot was used on that day or not. Most pots are not used the same day. You use it once. The last time you used it was maybe a day or two ago. So it's less of a problem. But even if it was used on that day for Sephardim, there's no problem. You can have it. There's also a question on what kind of a plate you should have it. It's always best to have it on the same plate as the pot. You avoid problem. But obviously, if you're going to have it on a dish that is meat, you can't put milk on it. What? Or neutral, right? If you're going to have milk with it, obviously don't put it on a plate that is meat. Then just put it on a regular neutral plate. That would be better. But as long as the milk is cold, because if the milk is hot, you're making that plate that was neutral, making it now halavi. Yeah, eventually we'll talk about it. Anyway, you want to use it in the same type of plate as the pot if possible. One more time, what? What's the problem of using a non-kosher pot? Eventually we'll get to it. That's a whole different area. No. We will talk about that eventually, how to make your kitchen kosher. Let's say you come to a hotel and you have an oven and a stove. You need to know how you can make it kosher. Let's say you bought an oven and a stove that's used. How can you make it kosher? Obviously, it's always better to buy something new. But we need to know the halachot anyway. In case you bought a pot and pan from a goy, how could you make it kosher? Let's say you're in a hotel and you want to use the microwave. Can you use the microwave? Can you use the coffee maker? You need to know. If you can't, how could you? Or what you need to do. So eventually we'll talk about it. That is a separate Wednesday. In how to make your kitchen kosher. If it was not kosher, let's say the Jew did not know about these halachot and his whole kitchen is tarif. Now he wants to start from scratch. He wants to buy new pots and pans. He wants to buy new plates. He may not have to. Some pots and pans, he can make them kosher by doing something. Some things he may have to throw away and buy new. So eventually we'll talk about that. So that's the problem with nat barnat. Now, if that food is very, very spicy, then you cannot eat it with milk. So if it was used in a meat pot, but it is extremely spicy, the spice brings out any flavor, or can bring out, and you would not be able to eat it with milk. Very, very spicy food would be an exception to this point of nat barnat, of not being able to eat it with milk. So there's no problem for Sephardim, but for Ashkenazim there is, unless of course it's not used on that day, it's less of a problem. Yes, if it's very spicy, it can become a problem. Any food that becomes, we'll talk about that next week, what happens to food that's very spicy. It's in a separate category. It does something, it can create problems that otherwise would not be there if it was not spicy. But because there's so many details, I'll leave that for next week. I just included it over here because that would be an exception to nat barnat. If the food is very, very spicy, and I said very, very spicy, not just a little bit of salt and pepper, then that would not qualify for nat barnat, and you should not eat it together with milk. Okay, just a few things to be aware of at all times, to be cautious about. We all have refrigerators. We have to be careful about since we put everything, we store everything in the refrigerator, and you're allowed to store everything, but because you can store everything, be careful where you place items. You put your leftover meat soup without the lid in the refrigerator, and you put a carton of milk next to it, it may fall in. So because you can store so many things in the refrigerator, just be careful that one does not fall into the other. That's all. So be careful in the refrigerator, putting it in a separate shelf or putting it away so one should not come to fall into the other. There's no problem, but you need to be careful. So you need to be aware that this can happen and just take, precaution. Same thing with sakum. A lot of people buy silverware, forks, knives, and spoons. For both, of course. They, of course, buy meat separate and dairy separate. But sometimes the two resemble each other. When you buy them, make sure that they look very, very different so you can identify. Or let's say you leave your home and you give it to your guests. You're welcome to use our home. Just remember, this side is milk and this side is meat. It may become confusing, especially if you have maids. They always cause trouble because they don't learn quickly or they don't want to learn. And it's a big problem. If you have a maid, I wouldn't trust them unless you've seen her work and you see that she's able to identify. So when you have silverware, make sure they're very different, that you remember yourself or that you're able to tell someone else which one is which. Some people like using different colored dishes, for example. The dairy is the blue, and the brown or the orange is the meat. Whichever you prefer, as long as you can distinguish the two. That's another area to be aware of, where mistakes happen. The stove. You have a range, right, with 4 burners. You're making goulash on one burner. On another burner, you're making, some dish with milk. It's okay. They're separate burners. They're far away from each other. But the problem is if they're cooking at the same time, one may spill over the other. There may be contact between the two. So it's okay, but just be careful. When you do that, problems may arise, especially if there's not too much of a distance between the cooking and the hood. You know how we have hoods on top of the oven, the stove? The hood, that takes the vapors and the steam. If the vent actually, if the vent is sitting very, very close, then the edim, the steam, the vapor of the two can mix. It can come back down and it can cause problems too, believe it or not. When we talk about an oven, remind me if I forget, we'll discuss about the problem of vapor or steam, of having the two very close to each other, especially when they both are uncovered. It can become a problem. Okay, let's go quickly to negi'at basar bechalav. Let's say you did have a piece of chicken or meat touch a piece of cheese. The both of them are cold. Is there a problem? No. If the two of them are cold, and I'll tell you what happens if they're not cold, if they're hot. But for the time being, just remember, if they're cold, all you need to do is wash them. Yeah, if they both are cold, it makes no difference. As long as I'll talk about it, what happens if it was roasted and spicy. Remember I spoke about spicy? Talk about that next week. But it's just simple meat, a piece of cheese, a piece of meat, a slice of meat. If they touch, nothing happens. Just wash them off. And we were talking all this time about eating together, cooking together. But if they touch, it's not a problem as long as they're cold. But you do need to wash them. Wash off the edges where they touch. All right. Let's say you want to make bread. A lot of people may have a bread maker, and it's very nice to have one. You put all the ingredients in it before you go to sleep, and you wake up in the morning to the smell of fresh bread. And now you're out to the supermarket to find a good recipe, and they sell them. Bread making, if you don't want to make it from scratch, I make it from scratch. I put in the ingredients from scratch. You put a spoonful of yeast. How do you know? Oh, Hashem. Yeast, and you put the salt and the sugar, right? It's nice. It's easy. But you can also buy the mixture. Now, what's the problem with the mixture? It has an OU. It's kosher. The problem is it has milk in it. And you cannot make dairy bread. Why not? You cannot make dairy bread. Because bread is a staple food that is eaten in all meals, whether you're having a dairy meal or whether you're having a meat meal. A lot of people like to have a piece of bread. You may end up using this bread when you're eating your steak. So no one can make dairy bread unless, there's 2 exceptions. I like it when there are exceptions. If there is a siman, this type of a bread can never be confused. It has this particular siman. I don't know, it's round instead of square. Nobody ever eats this kind of bread with meat. If it has a siman that nobody can confuse it, fine. Or if it's a small piece of bread that you can easily consume in a meal, in one little meal. So because you can easily consume that in a very small meal, we're not concerned that there'll be leftovers and you're going to have it. You're going to use it for the dinner tonight with your turkey. I think it's tomorrow, right? When do they eat the turkey? Right? We're not concerned that you're going to eat it with your meat tomorrow. It's so little. Then it's okay. So if you cook a little bit, fine. Have it with your coffee, with your milk. But otherwise, you can't bake a loaf of bread with milk inside. Very simple. A lot of people don't know this. It's called Isat Halal. Unless we have the two exemptions. Yes. That's the next point. Afiyat lechem basar. Let's say you want to break bread, halal, for Shabbat. And at the same time, you're making your chicken for Shabbat. Also a problem. Because if unless the chicken is covered, unless the meat is covered, that bread will have meat in it, and you might want to eat it for breakfast too. So even though the bread does not contain any meat, it's being baked at the same time as your chicken is. And if the chicken or meat is not covered, and you're baking them at the same time, it's going to be a problem for you to eat that challah with your coffee. So it's the same problem, or a similar problem. Okay, the last few minutes I just want to spend in these two areas. That is how to use one sink. If you have to, you only have one sink. It's always best in a real kosher kitchen to have two separate sinks. You avoid a lot of problems. You avoid some problems of Pesach too, but especially of basar v'halal. And we'll talk a little bit about a dishwasher, but a sink is much more serious. We talked about the first problem in the very beginning when you have leftover food inside. That's a problem of bishul. In the sink, leftover food of meat and dairy. There's other problems too with the dishes itself. You're going to have dishes in the sink of meat and dairy at the same time. It could be a problem of mixing the two, of cooking the two together, of having the flavors transferred perhaps from one to the other, especially when you have boiling hot water. The best way to do it, if you only have one sink, it's okay, you can still have one sink, but you have to do the following. Never put the two dishes at the same time in the sink. Never. Number two, always make sure that you're using soap and detergent most people do, but just make sure when you are rinsing or cleaning your dishes. Because if you do, then the detergent and the soap takes away the tam of the basar or the halab. It makes it a tam pagum. It loses the flavor. And then there's no problem. Some people, of course, wait, and do it not the same day perhaps. You don't have to do that. Some people, of course, have a steel sink. Some have a ceramic sink. And there's advantages to a steel sink. A steel sink, you can make hagala. You can pour boiling hot water over it, and you've made it kasher. You can use it for Pesach then. A ceramic sink is a problem with using it for Pesach or using it for basar v'halal because it absorbs and you cannot get it out by pouring hot boiling water on it. So the best thing is to just not use the sink at the same time if you have one sink, and then usually you have no problem. With a dishwasher, also, a lot of people only use a dishwasher for one type of dishes, only for their meat. Others want to use it for both because they have a lot of dishes of each, of the meat and the dairy. It's okay to use it for both if you follow the following instructions. If possible at all, have separate plastic inserts or containers for meat and dairy, if possible. Those things that hold the dishes, if possible at all, have separate ones. One for dairy, one for meat. Definitely don't do it at the same time. That most opinions would agree you're running into trouble. Even though it may be possible, since you are putting detergent and the water doesn't mix the two, if it ever happened, it may be okay. It's not as serious as if you had it in one sink together, touching. Here in the dishwasher, they don't touch, so it may be okay. But we're careful. With Baruch Hashem, we have the luxury of buying separate inserts, or perhaps waiting until one cycle is done and doing another cycle. Some people, for example, have a cycle of water in between the two cycles of meat and dairy. If you want to be extra careful, that's what you can do too. One cycle in between the two. So that empty cycle cleans the machine. But you don't really have to do that. If you have separate inserts that hold the dishes, and you do them at separate times, and you use detergent that gets into the dishes right away from the very beginning, it's not a problem. So if you want to use it for the two, you may be able to use it. So depending on your situation, you may not want to use it for both of them, but it's okay. As long as just remember, to avoid any problems, don't use it at the same time. And if you can, use separate inserts. And usually, you should not have a problem. For Pesach, Uzat Hashem, we'll be talking about it. There are other issues to be concerned about. But at least for Basar v'Halab, what we're concerned about is the two coming in contact with each other. And in the dishwasher, the situation is such that they probably won't get. But we're concerned about water, spritzing or squirting and touching or flowing in between the two when it's hot boiling water. There's a problem if that boiling hot water mixes the two. As I said before, the sink is much more of a problem because they're actually touching each other. Here they're not touching, so we're not concerned that the water will go from here and go to there. Because even if it did, it's usually the flavor is lost. Nevertheless, The Jewish people have always been very strict and careful, and even if according to the halakha something may not be required, they follow the stricter opinion, just to be on the safe side. So if you want to have a true kosher kitchen, then you take the necessary precautions and you avoid any problem. In the dishwasher, definitely don't wash them at the same time, and if possible, have separate inserts for each of the basar and the halal. That basically does it for today. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. But just remember what I said before. There will be many areas that may come up that we may not cover, that you may have questions about. Whenever you are in doubt, make sure to ask the rabbi. Don't rely on your own judgment to make a decision. Because we're dealing with isurim. We're dealing with areas that are prohibited by the Torah, perhaps, or with Rabbanan, and they can be a problem. So we need to verify if we have any doubts about them, what the halakha is. Yes? Yeah? Yeah, we'll talk about that next week. That's the issue. What happens if hot milk fell on cold meat? What happens if hot meat fell on cold milk? When it comes to hot food, that is a whole different area. Zat Hashem will cover that next week. What do you do if milk fell on the pot, on the outside of the pot, or if it fell inside the pot, right? What happens if they got mixed? What do you do with the mixture, with the food, with the dish? That Zat Hashem will cover next. Yeah, kavush is pickling or preserving foods together for over 24 hours. Because it's preserved, the mixture is held together. For example, you have meat inside milk for so long, it's like it's preserved, it's like it's pickled, even though you're not pickling it, but it's called kavush. Kavush is like mevushal. It's so powerful, that immersion, for such a long period of time, that it has a similar effect of bishul, and the flavor penetrates the meat all the way. The whole thing is, even though it's cold, the milk is cold, but because it's kavush for such a long period of time, it becomes asur, and of course it's forbidden for one to do that. So you will not be able to eat it, or be able to do it, even though the isur is only with the rabbanan, because it's not real bishul midoraita. It's not called real cooking, but it's like cooking, because that has a similar effect. Kavush, Rabbi say, kemevushal dami. It is as though you cooked it. It has a similar effect. So you could therefore not eat it. Yes. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so Zat Hashem will continue next week.